What happens when the very people you expect to stand by your side suddenly turn against you? Imagine this. A wealthy man, dressed in an expensive tailored suit, standing tall in his own mansion, surrounded by friends, relatives, and business partners. His words carry weight, his money gives him power, and his confidence makes him believe he owns the room. But on this night, in the middle of his grand dinner, his arrogance would face a test he never imagined. Because when he tried to humiliate the maid who had served his family for years, the last person he expected to speak up, his own daughter, would be the one to defend her dignity. Have you ever been in a moment where someone's pride pushed too far and you felt the weight of injustice hanging in the air? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you. The story begins in Boston, Massachusetts, inside the mansion of Richard Anderson, a man whose fortune was built on real estate deals and ruthless decisions. Richard was known not just for his wealth, but for the way he carried himself, commanding, untouchable, a man who believed that money and power placed him above everyone else. To his guests, he was the example of success. To those who worked for him, however, he was often something else entirely, cold, demanding, and ready to remind them of their place. Mary Johnson had been Richard's maid for several years. A woman of quiet strength, she moved carefully through the rooms of the mansion, polishing silver, arranging flowers, and making sure everything ran smoothly. She didn't complain, even when she was overlooked. She didn't fight back, even when small comments made her feel less than human. But she held on to her dignity with every step. What Richard failed to see, though, was that his children watched everything, and one of them, his teenage daughter Emily, saw more than he realized. On this particular evening, Richard was hosting an important dinner. The long oak table gleamed under crystal chandeliers. Fine china was set for every guest, and the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. Laughter and clinking glasses filled the space until Richard noticed Mary walking by with a tray. His eyes narrowed, and in a sudden decision that would change everything, he raised his voice. "Mary," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "why don't you stop sneaking around like a shadow and come clean the table right here, in front of everyone? At least, show us you can be useful tonight." The room went silent. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Richard smirked, expecting the silence to mean compliance. To him, it was a show of authority, a way to remind everyone, even his family, that he was in control. But what he didn't notice was Emily's expression changing. Emily had always admired Mary. She saw how kind she was, how she worked tirelessly without complaint. More than that, Emily had come to see Mary as more than just the maid. She was a human being, someone with feelings, someone who deserved respect. And as she watched her father turn Mary into the target of his arrogance, something inside her stirred. Have you ever witnessed a moment where the line between right and wrong was so clear, yet no one dared to act? This was that moment. Richard believed his wealth gave him permission to demean others, but he didn't expect that the strongest challenge to his pride would come from his own family. Emily pushed her chair back, her voice steady but firm as she looked straight at her father. And with that single act, the atmosphere in the room shifted. What happened next would expose the fragile line between power and dignity, between arrogance and true respect. And it would reveal that sometimes the most powerful lessons don't come from boardrooms, fortunes, or titles, but from the courage of a child who refuses to stay silent. Stay with me, because this is where everything begins to unravel. Maybe, as you hear this story, you've remembered a moment when someone's pride or arrogance tried to silence another person's dignity. Have you ever been there, watching, wishing someone would stand up, or maybe even being the one who felt small under someone else's words? If this stirs something in you, I'd love to hear it. Share your thoughts in the comments below, because every voice here adds depth to these stories. And who knows, what you write might be the exact words someone else needs to read today. And if you're feeling the weight of this message, take a second to tap the like button. It may seem like a small gesture, but it tells me these stories matter to you. It also helps this space stay alive, reaching more people who need to feel the same reminder about humility, compassion, and dignity. Most importantly, if you want to keep walking through stories like this one, narratives that shine a light on injustice but also reveal hope and redemption, make sure you subscribe. That way, every new video becomes part of our shared journey. This community is built by people like you, people who don't just watch but connect, reflect, and carry these lessons forward. Stay close, because the next part of this story will show how one young voice can change everything, even in the shadow of wealth and arrogance. Richard Anderson was the kind of man whose very presence seemed to demand attention. In Boston's business circles, his name carried weight, not because people admired him, but because they feared him. He was sharp in his decisions, relentless in negotiations, and unyielding in the image he projected. From the outside, his life appeared flawless, a sprawling mansion with marble floors that gleamed under golden chandeliers, a collection of luxury cars lined up in the driveway like soldiers ready for inspection, and a reputation polished by years of calculated moves. To many, he represented success. To those closest to him, however, the truth was more complicated. Richard's obsession wasn't just with money, it was with control. Every detail of his world had to reflect power. The cut of his suits, always tailored in dark navy or charcoal grey, the way his lawn looked, trimmed so perfectly it seemed artificial. Even his speech, carefully measured, carried a weight meant to remind everyone of his authority. Behind the walls of his mansion, though, this constant need for dominance cast long shadows over the people who lived with him. He often reminded his family that appearances were everything. "Respect comes from what people see," he would say, adjusting his cufflinks in front of a mirror. "If you look powerful, you are powerful. That's how this country works." These words echoed through the hallways like a mantra, one his wife had long since stopped challenging. But Emily, his daughter, had learned to listen differently. To her, these statements revealed not strength, but insecurity, a man desperate to prove his worth in ways that could never truly satisfy. The mansion itself was a symbol of his mindset. Built on the edge of a quiet neighborhood outside Boston, it stood like a monument to wealth. Visitors would often pause at the entrance, their eyes drawn to the towering columns and the massive front doors that looked like they belonged to a government building rather than a home. Inside, every piece of furniture, every painting, and every vase had been chosen not for comfort, but for status. The living room, with its velvet couches and carefully arranged bookshelves, felt more like a showroom than a place to relax. Richard walked through these rooms as though he owned more than the house. He owned the air itself. He never carried his coffee cup. It was always handed to him. He never bent to pick up something that had fallen. Someone else was expected to notice and take care of it. These small details may seem trivial, but together they painted the portrait of a man who believed he was above ordinary life. He was the millionaire who wanted the world to see not just his wealth, but his dominance. Yet beneath that polished surface lay cracks. His employees whispered about his temper, the sharp way his voice could cut through silence when he felt disrespected. "I don't pay you to think, I pay you to do," he once snapped at a driver who questioned a sudden change in plans. To Richard, compassion was weakness, and kindness was a distraction. His success had taught him that in business, emotions were liabilities. What he never realized was how much this mindset spilled into his personal life, shaping the way he treated everyone around him. At business dinners, Richard often took the spotlight. He would lean back in his chair, glass of red wine in hand, and tell stories of his victories. "When you're willing to make decisions others are afraid of," he'd say, "that's when you win. Fear is the chain holding most people down." His guests would nod, some out of agreement, others out of fear of offending him. It was clear that Richard wasn't just selling real estate. He was selling himself as the embodiment of power. But behind closed doors, When the guests left and the chandeliers dimmed, his family saw the other side. Emily, in particular, had learned that her father's obsession with authority was less about strength and more about avoiding vulnerability. She would watch him late at night, pacing his study with papers scattered across the desk, muttering to himself about competitors, lawsuits, or the next big deal. In those moments, she saw a man consumed by the very empire he had built. The most telling sign of Richard's character was the way he treated Mary, the maid who had been in their home for years. He rarely addressed her by name, preferring instead to refer to her role. "Where's the maid? Tell her to fix this," he would command. To him, Mary was invisible until he needed something. Yet Mary, with her quiet resilience, carried herself with more dignity than Richard ever noticed. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, but she had a strength that came from enduring life's struggles without losing her humanity. It was in this environment of polished surfaces and hidden truths that the seeds of conflict were sown. Richard believed his authority was unquestionable, reinforced by wealth and status. But what he failed to see was the growing distance between him and the people who mattered most. His daughter, silently observing, carried within her a mindset completely different from his own. Where Richard saw control as power, Emily saw compassion as strength. And while he believed appearances defined worth, she had learned that true value lay in character. On the evening of the dinner party, Richard's arrogance was at its peak. He had just closed a deal that added millions to his fortune, and the celebration at his mansion was his way of proving once again that he was untouchable. The dining room was a spectacle, long oak table polished to a shine, crystal glasses lined with precision, and guests chosen not just for friendship, but for the image they contributed to his circle. As he greeted them with his usual charm, his mind wasn't on their conversations, but on how he was being perceived. Every laugh, every nod of agreement, fed his ego. This was the stage where he performed, and he played the role of the untouchable millionaire flawlessly. Yet, beneath the polished smiles of his guests, some could sense the weight of his arrogance. It wasn't admiration they felt, but discomfort. Richard, of course, couldn't see it. For him, success was measured in silence. If no one challenged him, it meant they respected him. What he didn't realize was that silence didn't always mean respect. Sometimes it meant fear, and fear, unlike loyalty, can vanish in a single moment. That moment was closer than Richard thought. For as the evening unfolded, the contrast between his obsession with appearances and the quiet dignity of those around him would come into sharper focus. And in the midst of crystal chandeliers and carefully rehearsed conversations, a single decision would set in motion a chain of revelations that not even Richard could control. Because sometimes the greatest downfall of a man isn't triggered by his enemies. It begins inside his own home, in the presence of those who refuse to follow his example. And that truth was about to unfold in a way that would leave Richard Anderson facing more than just the judgment of his guests. It would force him to confront the hidden impact of his own arrogance. Mary Johnson was the kind of woman most people didn't notice at first glance. She moved with quiet precision, always making herself smaller than the space she occupied, as though she didn't want to disturb the air around her. Yet those who took the time to really see her would notice the way her hands were worn from years of work, the way her eyes carried both gentleness and a depth of unspoken stories, and the way her presence, though understated, carried dignity. In Richard Anderson's mansion, she was known simply as the Maid. But behind that title was a woman who had lived a journey filled with sacrifice, hidden truths, and silent strength. Born in a small town in New Hampshire, Mary grew up in a modest family that valued hard work more than words. Her father had been a mechanic, her mother a school cafeteria worker. Life wasn't easy, but it was honest. She learned early on that effort often mattered more than recognition, and that even the smallest tasks had value if done with care. These lessons stayed with her long after she left her hometown, moving to Boston in search of better opportunities. Working in wealthy households was never Mary's dream, but it became her path. After her husband passed away unexpectedly, leaving her to raise their young son alone, she needed stability. The job in Richard's mansion offered a paycheck that covered rent, groceries, and school supplies. To the Anderson family, she was the quiet figure in the background, polishing silver, ironing clothes, and making sure every room reflected the image of perfection Richard demanded. But to her son at home, she was everything: a provider, a role model, and the reason he still dared to dream. Mary never complained, not even when Richard barked orders without looking at her, as though she were part of the furniture. She accepted the weight of judgment that came with wearing a uniform in a house where designer suits and silk dresses were the standard. Yet beneath her silence lived emotions she rarely allowed herself to show. When Richard's guests ignored her, or when whispered comments reminded her she didn't belong in their world, the sting reached deep. Still, she reminded herself of her purpose. "This isn't about pride," she would whisper when alone, folding sheets in the laundry room. "It's about survival." There were moments, however, when survival felt heavier than she could bear. She would sometimes pause in the grand hallway, looking at the tall mirrors, reflecting back an image that seemed almost invisible. Who was she in this house? Not a guest, not a friend, barely even acknowledged, just the maid. Yet what no one realized was that her strength didn't come from recognition. It came from resilience. Each day she returned, each task she completed with care, was proof of her quiet endurance. Emily, Richard's daughter, was one of the few who noticed. On afternoons when her father wasn't around, Emily would sit at the kitchen counter while Mary prepared snacks. They would talk, not about wealth or status, but about simple things: school, books, memories of Emily's mother teaching her to bake cookies. "You remind me of my mom sometimes," Emily confessed once, her voice soft. Mary smiled, touched but careful. "Your mother raised a good heart," she replied, choosing her words with care. In those rare conversations, Mary felt seen. Her relationship with Richard, however, was a stark contrast. He rarely called her by name, often speaking in clipped commands. "Clean the study," he would say, without looking up from his papers. "The guests are coming, don't forget the dining room." To him, she was part of the behind-the-scenes machinery that kept his mansion flawless. And yet, while he valued the results of her work, he dismissed the humanity of the person performing it. That dismissal wasn't just cold, it was unjust. Mary carried that injustice quietly, never showing her son the weight of it when she returned home. To him, she was strong, steady, and full of hope. "One day," she would tell him while helping with homework, "your journey will look different. You won't have to fight for respect the way I do." These words were less a promise and more a prayer, whispered with the hope that her sacrifices would open doors for him. But the reality was harsher inside the Anderson mansion. Each day she endured subtle reminders of the gap between her world and theirs. When guests arrived, she blended into the background, careful not to make eye contact unless spoken to. When Richard's associates laughed loudly in the dining room, she carried trays of food with a steady hand, though her chest tightened at the thought of being dismissed if she faltered. Her existence in that house was one of invisibility, necessary but unacknowledged. Yet Mary wasn't naive. She understood human behavior more than most gave her credit for. Years of observing people from the background had given her insight into their decisions, their pretenses, their hidden truths. She saw the way Richard tightened his jaw when a deal didn't go as planned. She noticed the way guests smiled wide, but let their eyes reveal envy or judgment. And she knew that behind the polished surfaces of wealth, there were cracks of insecurity. These observations became her quiet power, even if no one realized it. Still, being judged by wealthier people left scars. There were nights when she would sit alone at her kitchen table, staring at her calloused hands, wondering if dignity was something she could keep holding on to. "Am I less because I clean their floors?" she once whispered into the silence, as if asking the question aloud might release its weight. But the answer always came back to her in the form of her son's smile. No, she wasn't less. She was more. She was carrying a responsibility few could truly understand. Mary's humility wasn't weakness. It was discipline. It was the mindset of someone who chose endurance over anger, quiet strength over bitterness. And though Richard thought of her as invisible, her very presence carried lessons he failed to see. Emily, however, absorbed them like sunlight. Watching Mary's patience, her gentleness, her way of never letting arrogance steal her dignity, Emily began to understand that respect wasn't earned through fear, but through compassion. This quiet bond between maid and daughter became a hidden thread in the Anderson household, one Richard was blind to. While he, obsessed over appearances, a transformation was happening right under his nose. His daughter's values were being shaped not by his speeches about success, but by the silent example of a woman he dismissed. That hidden truth, waiting just beneath the surface, was destined to collide with Richard's arrogance. And when that collision came, it would not be in whispers or private moments. It would be in the spotlight of his own dinner table, with his guests watching, his pride exposed, and his authority challenged not by rivals or enemies, but by the very people he assumed would always stand behind him. The evening of the dinner party arrived like a carefully staged performance, every detail orchestrated to project Richard Anderson's version of success. His mansion, already a monument to wealth, had been transformed into a showcase that night. The driveway glowed under soft golden lights, guiding luxury cars toward the grand entrance. Inside, the air was filled with the aroma of roasted duck, seasoned vegetables, and freshly baked bread, a spread designed not only to satisfy hunger but to impress. The dining room, the centerpiece of the event, shimmered under two massive crystal chandeliers, their light bouncing off polished silverware and crystal glasses set with military precision. Every guest who entered immediately understood that this was not just a dinner, it was a demonstration of power. Richard greeted them in his usual fashion, his voice deep and commanding, his handshake firm, his smile carefully controlled. "Welcome, welcome," he said, as though their presence was both an honor for him and a privilege for them. Business partners from Boston, a few political acquaintances, and distant relatives filled the space with laughter and murmurs of admiration. For Richard, this was validation. Every nod, every polite chuckle at his stories was proof that he remained untouchable, the man whose decisions shaped not only his fortune, but also the perception of those around him. Mary, meanwhile, moved quietly among the guests, her uniform freshly pressed, her hair pulled back neatly. She carried trays with the grace of someone who had done this countless times, placing dishes in front of guests and refilling glasses before they could ask. She worked invisibly, or at least that's how Richard preferred to think of her, an extension of the house, part of the behind-the-scenes machinery that allowed him to shine. But as she bent to adjust a fallen napkin, his eyes followed her, and something inside him stirred, a thought that would soon reveal the cracks in his polished facade. The conversations at the table flowed with ease, deals discussed, politics debated, family anecdotes exchanged. Richard dominated as expected, recounting a recent acquisition in the city. "When you understand the game, risk isn't risk at all," he said confidently, swirling the red wine in his glass. "It's just opportunity waiting for someone bold enough to claim it." His guests nodded, some out of genuine admiration, others out of fear of disagreeing. Emily sat quietly near the end of the table listening. She admired her father's intelligence, but had long since grown wary of his arrogance. Her gaze often drifted toward Mary, who, with her quiet efficiency, seemed to carry a dignity that didn't need chandeliers or polished floors to shine. Emily thought about how Mary's presence contrasted so sharply with the grandeur around them. She was not wealthy, not powerful, yet there was a steadiness about her that felt more real than anything else in that room. Richard, however, saw something entirely different. In his eyes, Mary was a convenient reminder of his superiority, a living symbol of the gap between his world and the one she came from. And as the evening progressed, with wine loosening his tongue and his ego demanding more recognition, he decided to make that contrast visible to everyone present. It started small, almost casual. He tapped his glass, silencing the hum of conversation. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk, "success isn't just about strategy. It's about knowing where you belong and making sure others know where they belong too." His words drew polite chuckles, though a few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Mary happened to be placing a dish on the table at that exact moment. Richard's eyes locked onto her, and his smirk deepened. "Take Mary here," he continued, gesturing toward her. "She knows her role, always in the background, quiet, dependable, not trying to rise above her station. That's why things run smoothly." The words cut through the room like a blade. For a moment, silence hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Mary froze, her hand tightening on the tray she held. She didn't respond. Years of experience had taught her that silence was often safer than words. But her eyes lowered, and in that small gesture, the sting of humiliation was clear. "Come now, Mary," Richard added, his tone sharper, more deliberate. "Why don't you show everyone how useful you are? Wipe down this table here, right in front of our guests. Let them see what keeps this house shining." Gasps were muffled, glances exchanged. Some guests shifted in their seats, unsure of whether to laugh along or to protest, but no one spoke. That was Richard's power. His presence could silence a room without effort. To him, this was a game, a way to reinforce the hierarchy, to remind everyone that he was the master of both the house and the people within it. Emily felt her chest tighten. She looked at Mary, who stood there with the tray, her face expressionless, but her eyes glistening with something unspoken. In that moment, Emily saw more than just a maid being asked to perform a degrading task. She saw the injustice of a system her father upheld, the mindset that wealth gave him the right to belittle others. She felt a surge of anger, but also of courage, rising in her chest. Richard, oblivious to the storm building beside him, leaned back as if savoring the discomfort in the air. He mistook silence for compliance, assuming that his words, his actions, and his authority would go unchallenged. But what he didn't realize was that in his attempt to humiliate someone he thought powerless, he had set the stage for a revelation that would change not only the atmosphere of that dinner, but the way his own family, and especially his daughter, saw him. The tray in Mary's hands trembled slightly, though she steadied it before anyone could notice. She whispered under her breath, so softly only she could hear, "It's just another moment. Hold on." For her, it was survival. For Emily, it was the breaking point. The room, filled with chandeliers and polished silver, had suddenly become a battleground, not of wealth or deals, but of dignity and conscience. And it was in that fragile silence, charged with tension and anticipation, that something unexpected was about to happen. Something that would reveal not just the truth about Richard's authority, but also the hidden strength of those he had underestimated for far too long. Richard didn't raise his voice at first. He let the room come to him. He watched the guests exchange glances, gauging their discomfort as if it were a metric on a balance sheet, something to manipulate. The chandeliers hummed faintly, the air conditioning whispered through vents hidden behind crown molding, and every fork held in midair seemed to tremble with the weight of what he was about to decide. Decisions. He loved that word. It made cruelty sound like leadership. With a lazy gesture toward the linen runner, he snapped his fingers, a sound as sharp as a camera shutter, catching the behind-the-scenes moment no one wanted preserved. "Mary," he said, drawing out her name like a teacher calling on a child. "Right here. This table. Show everyone how you keep our home presentable." Mary swallowed, the motion small and controlled, then set the tray down on the sideboard. Her movements had the grace of habit, the choreography of someone who had learned not to attract attention even while doing everything required. She walked to the end of the table where he pointed. A wine ring had stamped the white cloth like a bruise. She reached for a napkin. Richard leaned back, fingers steepled. "Not with that," he said, smirking. "Damp cloth. If you're going to do it right. We have standards here." A cousin coughed into his hand. One of the partners shifted in his chair, eyes flicking to the doorway as if escape were an option. The silence grew its own spine, tall and rigid. In silence, people tell you everything, their loyalties, their fears, their price. Richard recognized it and mistook it for consent. He often mistook things for what he needed them to be. Mary went to the kitchen entrance and returned with a small bowl of water and a microfiber cloth. Not one glass clinked while she moved, not one chair scraped, not one person dared puncture the tension. She set the bowl down gently and wrung the cloth over it, the water falling in thin silver threads. When she reached to clean the stain, Richard's voice cut across the table. "You see, this is what order looks like," he announced. "Everyone in their role, a system that works. It's about mindset, about knowing where you fit in the chain." He turned to the man seated at his right, a developer he'd been wooing for months. "This is how projects stay on schedule. No confusion, no bleeding hearts, no wasted time." Mary froze for a heartbeat, cloth still in hand. She knew better than to argue, but she wasn't made of glass either. She bent to her work with precise strokes, cleaning the ring until the cloth lifted nothing more. Her face revealed nothing, which is different from emptiness. It was discipline, a quiet refusal to let another person write her worth. She dabbed the cloth, lifted it, dabbed again, and the white regained its quiet. Richard smiled like a man proud of a speech, then tipped his chin to amplify the spectacle. "Mary," he continued, "since you're here, why don't you do the stretch down the center? Make sure it's perfect. I know you take pride in being thorough." The words, "take pride," rolled out as if he owned them, a manufactured compliment made to sting. Mary's thoughts were a slow, steady tide. She remembered the first time she'd ironed a shirt for a nurse during her husband's chemo, how the steam had fogged the kitchen window, and how he'd joked that she could press a crease straight into the ocean. She remembered the funeral home's carpet, too clean to weep on. She remembered her son at the table with his math workbook, the way he said, "Mom, when I grow up, I want to buy you a day off." Memory can be a shield if you hold it right. She pressed the cloth along the center line of the runner, smoothed a wrinkle that no one else would have noticed, and whispered to herself, "Just keep breathing." Richard watched her hands, then addressed the room with a laugh that never reached his eyes. "You know what I like about Mary? She never argues, no drama. Some people bring problems to the table, she takes them away." He tilted his head, as if confiding a hidden truth. "It's rare to find someone who understands their lane." Emily felt the words land like stones. She had heard them before, in boardrooms, in hallways, in the quick, quiet ways her father sorted people into boxes labeled useful or irrelevant. She stared at Mary's hands, at the small movements that kept her home from unraveling. "Dad," she said without meaning to say it out loud, just a breath of sound, a warning inside a name. Her father didn't look at her. He was busy playing to the audience, continuing the performance. "Mary," he said cheerfully, "you missed a spot." He pointed to a place that didn't need cleaning. It didn't matter. Precision wasn't the point. The point was power. "Here, let's show our guests we set the standard." Mary looked at the supposedly missed spot and then at him, only briefly. "Yes, Mr. Anderson," she said. The words were neutral, but neutrality isn't surrender. She moved the cloth again, slow, methodical, so steady that even the chandeliers seemed to still themselves to watch. One of the partners cleared his throat, then ventured a weak chuckle as if to prove he was still on Richard's side. Richard seized it. "See?" he said. "It's not so hard. The right roles, the right rules. You keep order, you keep outcomes." He lifted his glass. "To outcomes." A few raised their glasses, the crystal chiming reluctantly. Mary continued along the table's edge, and the room became a study in careful pretenses. The guests' smiles were a little too tight, their eyes a little too bright. Emily watched them catalogue their own decisions, say nothing and preserve the relationship, or speak and risk the impact. It's the kind of math that reveals character. "I can't sit here and pretend this is normal," she thought, the words forming like a current gathering speed. Richard wasn't finished. He set his wine down and gestured at the floor beneath Mary's feet. "And after that," he said, "check the wood. I think someone tracked in dirt. Can't have people thinking we don't keep things spotless." His grin widened. "Presentation is everything." Mary's spine lengthened so subtly you might have missed it. She knelt and swiped the baseboard with the cloth, not because it needed it, but because she understood something crucial. About escalation. You don't always diffuse it by refusing the task. Sometimes you diffuse it by demonstrating that the task cannot define you. "This won't break me," she told herself. "I've walked through worse and kept going." Richard turned to his sister across the table, a woman who knew him well enough to recognize the pageantry of humiliation. She opened her mouth, then closed it. "Fear is a quiet negotiator. It bargains away pieces of you in exchange for temporary comfort." She took a sip of water and looked down. "Tell us, Mary," Richard said suddenly, clapping once as if calling for a musical cue. "Do you like your job?" The question wasn't curiosity. It was a trap, a performance line crafted to pin her to the wall of the moment. Mary rose slowly, bowl in hand. She didn't answer right away, not because she was searching for words, but because she understood timing. She set the bowl back on the sideboard and folded the cloth neatly. Then she spoke with a calm that didn't belong to the evening, but to her own journey. "I take pride in doing good work," she said. "That's what my parents taught me." Richard laughed. "Good work," he echoed, making the phrase sound like a child's drawing held up beside a Monet. "That's sweet. And some of us," he gestured at himself with a flourish, "are taught to aim higher." Emily's fork touched the plate with a small chime. "Dad," she said, a little louder now, but he kept going, rising in his chair like a man approaching a podium. "You see," Richard said to the table, "you can spend your life cleaning up messes, or you can be the one making decisions that move things forward. It's a different class of responsibility." He lifted his glass again. "To responsibility." Mary looked for a moment at the polished surface of the table she had just cleaned. It reflected the room back at her in a softened, watery way. The faces, the lights, the man at the head who believed this reflection was the truth. She thought of her son again, of the pocket note he'd tucked into her lunch bag that morning. "You got this, Mom." She touched the edge of the table with her fingertips as if to steady the world, and then stepped back. "Is there anything else you need, Mr. Anderson?" she asked, perfectly poised. Richard weighed the moment and, finding no resistance he considered meaningful, went for the final flourish. "Actually," he said, "why don't you bring the dessert early and announce it to the room? Let's give you a spotlight since you're already center stage." He smiled as if he'd made a generous offer. "Tell everyone what you're serving, nice and clear." The request wasn't about dessert. It was about hierarchy. He wanted her voice to echo through the room in a way that placed her below everyone else, a script written to remind her where she stood. Mary inclined her head. "Yes, sir." She turned toward the kitchen, each step measured. To anyone who didn't know, her composure might have looked like obedience. But composure can also be armor. She reached the swinging door, paused just long enough to breathe in, then pushed through. A murmur threaded the room as soon as she disappeared, a low current of unease that people tried to dress up as small talk. "Tough market lately," someone said too brightly. "Interest rates," another added. It was the conversational equivalent of looking away from an accident. The impact remained whether they faced it or not. Richard basked in the uneasy glow. He believed he had steered the evening back under his control, believing that humiliation was a leadership style, that dominance was a kind of truth. He mistook stillness for submission and silence for approval. Hidden truths don't announce themselves, they wait. That is their patience and their power. When Mary returned with the dessert tray, lemon tarts glazed to a glassy sheen, she stood at the head of the table, a place she never occupied, and lifted her chin just enough to be heard. "Dessert is ready," she said, voice. "Even lemon tart with almond crust." She placed a plate in front of Richard first, not out of deference, but because that was the route required by the seat map she'd memorized. Then she moved clockwise, attentive to the rhythm of service, as if the room had not pressed a thumb to her dignity minutes before. Richard watched her and chuckled, unable to resist one last cut. "Careful not to drop it," he said. "Wouldn't want the night to fall apart over crumbs." She set a plate down at Emily's place, and for a second their eyes met. Emily saw weariness, yes, but also resolve, that rare, steady light people carry when they've decided they won't be defined by someone else's narrative. "Thank you," Emily said softly. The words were ordinary, but the intention behind them changed the chemistry of the air. Mary finished her circle and stepped back. The table was fully set again, every plate in its place. The performance resumed. But performances are fragile. All it takes is one line spoken, from the wrong heart, to unravel the script. Richard lifted his fork and, before tasting the dessert, looked down the table toward Mary, as if checking to see whether his arrangement still held. He addressed the room with that smooth baritone he used in investor meetings. "Some people will tell you that strength looks like kindness," he said. "I disagree. Strength is making the hard calls even when people don't like you for it." He tapped the plate with his fork, a theatrical ding. "And tonight I made sure we had a standard." It was so smooth he almost believed it himself. He didn't see that the standard he'd set wasn't excellence, but disregard. He didn't see how the room had taken his measure and found a gap. From his vantage point, power looked uninterrupted. From everyone else's, cracks had appeared across the facade. That is the hidden truth about control. The tighter you grip it, the more people notice what you're afraid to lose. Emily's chair whispered against the rug as she shifted, the tiniest sound, but in a room that had learned the cost of speaking it was nearly a shout. She could feel her pulse in her throat, a steady drum calling her to the surface. She looked at her father, then at Mary, then at the guests whose eyes skittered away from hers. Choices present themselves at inconvenient times, and the journey toward becoming who you are rarely happens in private. "Enough," she thought, the word landing inside her like a stone that displaces water and changes. "It's level." Richard cut into his tart, satisfied that the moment had been resolved, that the hierarchy had been polished along with the silver. He didn't see that the impact of his spectacle had already rippled outward, touching places in the room he could not control. In the corner, the house pianist, brought in to provide tasteful background music, rested his hands above the keys, unsure whether to begin. The staff in the doorway watched with carefully blank expressions that weren't blank at all. And Mary, standing near the sideboard, took one breath that went a little deeper than the last. The dinner had reached that delicate point where anything could tilt it. One laugh too loud, one remark too honest, one truth spoken from the only place that could make it matter. The script Richard wrote for the night had seemed airtight when he rehearsed it in his head. But scripts bend in the presence of conscience, and the person he least expected to edit his lines was about to step into the light. With a voice that didn't need volume to rearrange the room, Emily didn't stand with a dramatic scrape of the chair or a shout that shattered glass. She stood the way people do when the decision has been made 1,000 times in private and finally arrives in public. Her knees brushed the underside of the table, her napkin slid to the floor, and every head turned because stillness can be louder than noise. She was 17, old enough to read a balance sheet but too young, in her father's estimation, to speak about dignity in front of his partners. That assumption was about to meet its limit. She placed her palms lightly on the table's edge, steadying herself, and looked past the chandeliers, past the curated paintings, straight at Mary, who had become the unwilling centerpiece of a lesson no one here had intended to learn. "Dad," Emily said, her voice clear without reaching for volume, "this isn't leadership." The words did not quiver. They traveled the length of the table and landed with a weight out of proportion to their size. Conversations that had been frantically resurrected a moment ago died again, mid-sentence. Forks hovered like commas in a text gone wrong. Somewhere in the hall, the pianist's hands floated just above the keys, frozen between silence and song. Richard looked up, startled not by opposition. He'd been opposed plenty, but by the source of it. Emily's eyes were steady, the color of the Atlantic on a day without wind. She didn't blink. "Excuse me?" he said, a soft threat hidden in courtesy. Emily moved around her chair and took 2 small steps into the open space beside the table, placing herself intentionally between Mary and the room. "I said, this isn't leadership." She glanced at Mary, and the glance carried a promise, the kind people make with posture as much as words. "It's humiliation dressed up as standards." Laughter lived in Richard's throat and tried to escape, a reflex he'd used to disarm countless challenges. But it found no air. All at once he became conscious of eyes, partners, donors, relatives, collecting data, revising models of him in real time. "Emily," he answered, "you don't understand what it takes to keep a home, a business, a team in line. People need structure. They expect it." He gestured vaguely around the table, as if the glassware could confirm his thesis. "It's about mindset, about excellence." "Excellence doesn't require cruelty," Emily replied. "Respect isn't a budget item you cut when the night runs long." She turned to Mary, and a softness entered her face that no chandelier had ever created. "Mary, you don't have to do this. Not like this." Mary's hands, still and disciplined at her sides, flexed almost imperceptibly. She was not used to anyone stepping into the path of a storm on her behalf. "I'm fine, Emily," she said, but the sentence carried layers. Gratitude, caution, the behind-the-scenes arithmetic of risk. Richard leaned back, reclaiming his posture, his voice carefully and casual. "We're having a family moment," he announced to the table, as if renaming the scene would tidy it up. "Guests, enjoy your dessert." Then to his daughter, low and precise, "Sit down." "No," Emily said. One word, unadorned, sharper than any monologue. "Not while she's being used as a prop for your authority." Her gaze moved across the guests, not accusatory, simply real. "We all know what this is, and we also know what it isn't." A partner on the left cleared his throat as if to intervene, then thought better of it. The cousin who had laughed earlier stared at his tart as if it contained a map out of the room. The house staff, clustered just beyond the doorway, seemed to lean inward by a collective millimeter, the way people do when they sense that something true is about to be said. Richard's smile returned, brittle. "You're making this bigger than it is," he said. "I asked for a table to be cleaned. I asked for presentation. That's all. You're turning decisions into drama." His eyes flicked to the developer at his right, seeking confirmation. Finding none, he pressed ahead alone. "You want to learn how the world works, Emily? Watch the people who make it work." He gestured toward himself with a small flourish. "Not the ones who complain when it does." "I'm not complaining," Emily answered, voice steady. "I'm drawing a line." She turned again to Mary. "How many times have you been talked to like this here?" "Emily," Mary cautioned gently, not to protect Richard, but to protect Emily from the blowback that power often delivers when publicly defied. "It's okay." "It's not okay," Emily said. "It's common. That's different." She looked back at her father. "You taught me to notice patterns. Here's one. Whenever you're uneasy, you reach for someone with less power and make them carry it for you. That's not a standard. It's a shortcut." The word shortcut nicked him, because somewhere deep beneath polished self-narratives, he knew it was true. His jaw tightened. "An old habit. I protect this family," Richard answered, voice low. "Every choice I make has impact. You like your school, your life? That's the result of being the one who does what others won't." "You confuse risk with disrespect," Emily said. "One builds, the other corrodes. Look around." She didn't sweep the room with her arm. She didn't need to. Eyes were already on her. "People aren't impressed right now. They're deciding who you are." He laughed then, more from instinct than humor. They know who I am, he said, and the line, usually effective, fell flat. They know what I deliver. Emily breathed in, a measured breath that evened the tremor in her chest. I know who Mary is, she said. She holds this house together in 100 ways no one notices. She remembers everyone's allergies. She keeps the keys labeled so your new driver doesn't panic. She irons your shirts at midnight when you change your mind about what looks stronger in the morning. Emily glanced at Mary, and then back to the guests. Behind the scenes doesn't mean beneath. Mary felt something long dormant rise in her, not rebellion exactly, but recognition. The secret relief of not defending oneself alone. Thank you, she murmured, not loud, just enough for Emily to hear. Richard's temper reached for the easiest exit. Control. This is finished, he said, standing now, height deployed as argument. Mary, you're dismissed for the evening. He looked to the staff in the doorway. We'll handle the rest. Mary's head lifted. Being dismissed like a smudge on a ledger was normal. Being defended in the same breath was not. She set her shoulders, and her voice found a register that didn't apologize. Mr. Anderson, she said, I'll go if that is what you want, but I won't leave because I'm ashamed. I did nothing wrong. The line threaded the room with an electric hum. It wasn't defiance. It was clarity. Clarity has a different weight. It doesn't shout. It rearranges gravity. Emily stepped closer to her father, not intimidated by his height or by the money woven into his suit. If you dismiss her, you dismiss me, she said, and not from this table, for tonight, from the story you're telling in this family. He blinked, the calculation behind his eyes suddenly visible. He'd learned to read markets, juries, committees. Now he searched his daughter's face for leverage and found none. You don't mean that, he said, softening, attempting a detour. You're upset. I'm paying attention, she said. There's a difference. She glanced at the guests, forcing herself not to shrink from their presence. We talk a lot in this house about transformation, about what it takes to win. Maybe the first win is refusing to let humiliation be a management style. Richard's sister spoke then quietly. Richard, it was not an indictment, more like a hand placed on a door before it slams. He didn't look at her. The developer cleared his throat again. A ritual now. Richard, perhaps, he began, but Richard's hand rose half an inch, and the sentence dissolved. Power can be a muscle memory. He tried to flex it. Mary will go home, Richard declared, regaining his baritone. We'll conclude dinner in peace. Emily will apologize for disrupting our guests. He turned to his daughter, offering a path back to obedience that saved face for everyone but the truth. Now, Emily didn't move. I won't apologize for protecting dignity, she said. I won't apologize for calling out a hidden truth, everyone. Here can feel. Her voice warmed, not with anger, but with something like sorrow. You taught me to be brave in rooms that want me quiet. I am being brave, just not in the way you planned. Mary felt the floor under her feet in a new way, solid and unnegotiable. Emily, she said, a small smile forming, you don't need to do this for me. I'm doing it for us, Emily answered, for the kind of people we decide to be. Richard's control strategy faltered. He looked at the staff, loyal eyes, practiced neutrality, and saw for the first time the impact of his choices etched in silent witness. He looked at his guests and recognized not just unease, but assessment. A mirror had been raised, and it wasn't gilded. He reached for certainty, the way a man gropes on a nightstand for his watch in the dark. This is my house, he said, trying to make the sentence declare more than property. And that's why it matters, Emily replied. A house is a set of walls. A home is a set of values. The line was not rehearsed. It arrived the way honest sentences do, intact and undeniable. Silence spread out like a lake, catching rain, each drop a small revelation. The pianist lowered his hands to the keys and rested them there, not playing, just making contact. The staff stepped back a fraction, and their retreat said as much as any advance could have. At the table, forks settled, glasses remained untouched, and in that collective pause, the room learned something about consequence. Richard exhaled slow. He could pivot. He always pivoted. He could make a joke, downshift, paint this as a quirky father-daughter moment, salvage the evening with charm. The script assembled itself in his mind, the old, reliable one where he controlled the narrative. But a different script had entered the room and was rewriting his lines as he spoke them. He looked at Emily and saw not a rebellious teenager, but a person whose decisions were beginning to leave their own wake. "You're embarrassing." "Yourself," he said, but even he heard the thinness in it. "I'm refusing to be embarrassed by kindness," Emily replied. "That's a different thing." She turned once more to Mary. "If you want to go home, I'll walk you out. If you want to stay, you're staying on your terms." Mary's choice lived in the space of a breath, then another. "I'll finish my shift," she said, calm as a settled tide. "Not for the show of it, for my own peace." She looked at Richard, and her words carried no malice. "I work with care. That's how I was raised." Something eased in the room, not resolved but clarified. Guests adjusted in their chairs, as if boundaries had been redrawn, and their bodies were recalibrating to fit inside them. Richard's sister took a slow sip of water, watching her brother over the rim of the glass, with eyes that had seen his victories and knew the cost of them. The developer lowered his gaze to the tablecloth, tracing the weave with a fingertip, like a man reacquainting himself with texture after years of gloss. Emily moved back toward her chair, but she didn't sit. She stayed standing, not to loom, but to anchor. Her presence had changed the geometry of the space, and everyone felt it. "Mary," she said, "if anyone speaks to you like that again here, they'll have to go through me first." Richard's mouth opened and closed. Words lined up and refused to march. He understood leverage. He understood optics. He didn't yet understand what it meant to be measured against the most intimate tribunal, a child watching the parent decide who they are when it costs them something. That reckoning rarely happens in a boardroom. It happens at a dinner table where the dessert cools and the truth warms its hands on the edge of the fire. The chandeliers threw a softer light now, not because the bulbs had dimmed, but because certainty had. The night had shifted. Status symbols receded a few inches into the background. Human beings stepped forward that same distance. A transformation had begun, not announced with fanfare, not sealed with a promise, but marked in the quiet recalibration of what would and would not be allowed under this roof. Emily drew a breath and let it go, like a runner after the first mile, committed, not finished. She reached for her napkin on the floor and set it on the table, a small order restored but under new terms. The pianist touched 3 chords so softly they almost didn't exist, a thread of sound that reminded everyone time was still moving, that the evening wasn't over, even if something inside it had ended. And as the guests looked at one another, testing words again, it became apparent that the next movement in this night wouldn't be scored by crystal and silver, but by the consequences of what had just been said aloud. The room didn't explode into chaos. It didn't need to. The silence itself became the loudest sound anyone had ever heard within those walls. It spread across the table like a wave, swallowing the small talk, flattening every forced smile, silencing the forks that had been inching toward dessert. For the first time in years, Richard Anderson wasn't the one orchestrating the atmosphere. The power he thought he owned, the control he had polished and displayed like fine silver, was slipping between his fingers. His daughter's words hovered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Every guest had heard them, and though no one spoke immediately, their eyes betrayed what they felt. Some glanced down at their plates, their expressions carefully blank, terrified to be caught on the wrong side of this confrontation. Others looked openly at Richard, not with admiration, but with something sharper, judgment, or worse, recognition. They had all been in rooms with powerful men who hid cruelty behind charm, and now they were watching that curtain burn. Richard felt the weight of their eyes, but mistook it at first. He straightened his jacket, lifted his chin, and attempted to smirk, as though his daughter's words were nothing more than teenage rebellion. "Kids," he muttered with a forced chuckle, pretending to include the guests in a private joke. "They don't understand the weight of responsibility yet." He expected laughter. What he got was silence so complete that even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. One of the business partners, a man named Charles Whitmore, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had built his fortune in finance, and he recognized the scent of a market. Turning, his gaze moved from Richard to Emily, and then to Mary, still standing with quiet composure at the side of the room. Charles knew what he was witnessing wasn't a child rebelling. It was a transfer of credibility, a shift in narrative that could impact more than dinner. It could impact alliances. "She has courage," Charles thought, though he didn't dare say it aloud. Across the table, Richard's sister kept her eyes locked on her brother. She had known him since childhood, had seen the boy, who once sulked when he lost at baseball, the teenager who measured his worth in trophies and popularity. Now she saw that same pattern grown into a man who demanded applause at every turn. But applause was fragile, and tonight it had deserted him. She tightened her grip on her glass, holding back the words pressing at her throat. Emily, still standing, didn't waver. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't dramatic. Her calm was the very thing that stripped power from her father's performance. "This isn't about responsibility," she said evenly. "It's about compassion, and you showed none." She didn't look at the guests when she said it, but they felt the words just as much as Richard did. Richard's jaw clenched. His voice, when it came, was softer but sharper. "Emily, sit down. You don't know what you're doing." She shook her head. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm refusing to be silent while someone is treated like they don't matter." Her gaze moved again to Mary. "She matters. Even if you pretend she doesn't." A murmur ran along the table, not loud, but enough to signal the shift. Guests, who had once nodded at Richard's every word, were now exchanging glances, not with him, but with each other. The hidden truth had surfaced. His authority wasn't as unshakable as he wanted them to believe, and in that moment, the image he had spent years constructing began to crack. Richard tried to patch it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his hands as though calming a restless crowd, "this has gone far enough. We came here tonight to celebrate success, to enjoy a meal together. Let's not lose sight of that because of a misunderstanding." He gave a tight smile. "My daughter is passionate, I'll give her that. But passion isn't the same as wisdom." But the room wasn't buying it. Authority thrives on perception, and perception was slipping from his grasp. Where once his words would have been enough to reset the mood, now they only deepened the contrast between his arrogance and Emily's courage. It wasn't her age or her position that gave her power. It was the clarity of truth. People always remember the moment when truth cuts through pretense. Mary, who had endured years of quiet slights, lowered her eyes for just a second, not out of shame, but to steady the well of emotions pressing at her chest. No one had ever defended her like this, not in front of others, not publicly, not at the cost of status. For her, Emily's words weren't just courage, they were restoration. The guests felt it too, even those who had no loyalty to Mary, who barely registered her existence before, sensed the impact of what had happened. Something had shifted in the air, a recalibration of power, and the man who had built his empire on dominance was suddenly the one being measured, weighed, and silently questioned. Richard's laughter tried to return, but it faltered. "Teenagers," he said again, though quieter this time, his eyes darting across the table. He expected someone, anyone, to save him with a nod, a chuckle, an approving glance. But instead, the guests avoided his gaze. He was used to being the center of gravity, the sun around which everyone orbited. Now, for the first time, he felt what it was to be the shadow. Emily's voice came once more, steady and clear. "Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you give." The words hung in the air, undeniable, unpolished, and yet sharper than any of her father's practiced speeches. The humiliation was no longer Mary's. It had reversed, landing squarely on Richard's shoulders, exposed in the very room he had designed to showcase his power. And though no one dared say it aloud, the decision had been made in the minds of everyone present. The man who tried to humiliate others had only managed to humiliate himself. The pianist's fingers hovered again, and this time he pressed a single chord, soft, almost hesitant, as though even music needed permission to return. It was a sound that carried more truth than Richard's words had all night. He forced a smile, but it looked brittle, like glass under pressure. He raised his glass again, hoping to reclaim control with the familiar ritual of a toast. "To family," he said, voice strained. No one moved to lift their glass. The silence that followed was a verdict more powerful than any shouted accusation. And as Richard sat there, confronted by the absence of the approval he craved, he finally felt the weight of the shift. His authority, once unquestionable, was slipping. His daughter had exposed not only his cruelty, but also the emptiness behind it. The applause he expected had turned into a mirror he couldn't escape. Emily, still standing, placed her hand gently on the back of Mary's chair, anchoring her presence. That simple gesture told the room where loyalty now lived. The revelation wasn't in the words alone. It was in the decision to stand, to shield, to call out what everyone else was too afraid to name. The impact of that choice rippled outward, reshaping the evening in ways Richard had not predicted. And though he still sat at the head of the table, he no longer felt like the one in control. Something had shifted, something irreversible, and it was only beginning to show its true weight as the night continued. Emily didn't announce the choice she made next. She simply crossed the room, the way a person steps from one island of belief to another, and refuses to go back. The carpet softened her footfalls, but the shift was visible, undeniable, the kind of movement that rearranges the coordinates of a night. She reached Mary at the sideboard and, without hesitation, took her hand. No theatrics, no flourish, just the plain human contact that says, "I see you." The gesture wasn't large in space, but it was huge in consequence. It cut through the altitude of chandeliers and the weight of money and brought the evening back to ground level, where dignity breathes. Emily eased a chair out with her knee and sat beside Mary, not as a guest beside staff, but as one person beside another. The visual said more than speeches ever could. A teenager had chosen her seat, and in that quiet decision, the room discovered a new map. Mary didn't pull away. She felt the warmth in Emily's fingers and let it anchor her, the way you anchor a small boat so it doesn't drift when the tide turns unexpectedly. She had held metal trays, laundry baskets, polished silver that never felt like it belonged to her. But this was different, human. Hands tell the truth. They don't need a microphone. For a heartbeat, Mary closed her eyes, and when she opened them, the room seemed to have shifted by a few degrees, like a picture corrected on a wall you hadn't realized was crooked. Richard noticed, but dismissed it as theatrics. He leaned into his chair, as if the leather could certify his authority, and tried to restart the ritual. "Let's finish dessert," he said lightly, reaching for the script that had always worked. A fork touched crystal and made a single lonely ring that didn't catch. The guests didn't move. It wasn't defiance, it was recalibration. People were adjusting their posture to a new center of gravity, and the new center wasn't him. Across from them, Charles Whitmore watched with the trained attention of a man who measures risk for a living. He had seen boardrooms recalibrate after unexpected data, and this looked similar. A quiet correction after the hidden truth reveals itself. Charles placed his fork down gently and folded his hands. He wasn't going to save Richard with a laugh line. He wasn't going to condone what had just been dismantled by a single act of solidarity. Even his silence now had shape. Emily didn't speak yet. She let the room absorb the image. The daughter of the house, not standing above, but seated beside. That alone shifted the narrative from humiliation to human worth. The pianist, still unsure whether music was welcome, pressed a cautious chord progression, simple, unobtrusive, like a heartbeat returning to normal. It gave the moment a spine. Richard's sister, Elaine, finally released the breath she'd been holding. She had kept peace at too many dinners to count, smoothing edges, translating his bluntness to guests as ambition. But tonight, the translation wasn't working. She lowered her glass and stood halfway, a gesture that never committed to confrontation, but refused collusion. "Mary," she said softly, "would you sit?" It wasn't a command, and it wasn't charity. It was a recognition that seats mean something in a house obsessed with rank. Mary looked from Elaine to Emily, then to the table where she had always hovered and never belonged. "I'm all right," she said, voice steady. And yet, because Emily didn't let go of her hand, the refusal didn't carry distance. It carried choice. Choice changes the texture of a room. You could feel it. Richard tapped a knuckle against his plate, the gesture small but sharp. He needed the night back, needed it to submit. "We're losing the thread," he announced, as though he alone guarded coherence. "Mary has work. We have guests. Let's keep this in order." Emily turned her head, the movement slow enough to make eye contact count. "Order that empties people of dignity isn't order," she said. Then she looked back at Mary. "You don't have to choose between respect and a paycheck. Not here." The line wasn't a policy. It was a vow. Vows carry farther than rules when spoken by someone who means them. A murmur touched the far end of the table, subtle, uncertain, like a wind testing a door. One of the junior partners, a man young enough to still remember why he'd wanted to be decent before he wanted to be rich, set his napkin down and cleared his throat. "Emily's right," he said, not loud, just clear. "We can do better than this." His eyes flicked to Richard and then away, a small courage, but courage nonetheless. Mary absorbed all of it, the music, the murmur, the pressure. "I'll finish serving," she said, not out of submission, but because her dignity included excellence. "And then I'll go home to my son." The sentence placed her life on the table with everyone else's. She had a journey too, with roots and reasons. She wasn't a prop. She was a person whose decisions had impact beyond this room. Emily squeezed her hand. "When you leave, I'll walk you out," she said. "No one should have to walk through a night like this alone." The guests were hearing more than sentences. They were hearing a change in mindset. Richard had always framed nights like these as performance and proof. Proof of his taste, proof of his control, proof that he could summon admiration like a service. Emily's gesture reframed the night as a test of values, and the test had already delivered its first grade. Aunt Elaine, returning to her chair, offered Mary a linen napkin from her own place setting, an unflashy ritual of equality. "For your hands," she said, not because Mary needed it, but because care rarely asks for permission to be small. Mary took it, nodded once. The staff by the door straightened almost imperceptibly, and their eyes warmed. Behind-the-scenes people recognize a change before anyone else. They live by reading rooms. Richard tried one more pivot. "Emily," he said, voice hushed for intimacy and sharpened for effect, "you're making a spectacle." She shook her head. "No, Dad, I'm ending one." The words were spare and cut clean. She stood, still beside Mary, and faced the table, not as a performer, but as a witness. "We talk about leadership here like it's only strategy, but leadership is also how you treat the people who can't pay you back." The developer, who had kept quiet all evening, leaned forward, elbows on the table in a posture he usually avoided because it creased his suit jacket. "Richard," he began carefully, "optics matter." A safe sentence for a man who wanted to keep his contract and his conscience. "This is not playing well." Richard's smile didn't return. He tried to produce it and found the machinery jammed. "Optics?" he repeated as if the word were a betrayal. "Since when do we run our house on optics?" "Since you invited optics to dinner," Emily said, not unkindly. It was the hidden truth laid bare. He had turned the evening into a stage, and the stage had turned on him. Mary let herself sit just for a moment, on the edge of the chair Emily had pulled out earlier. She didn't relax into it. She perched like someone learning a new way to exist in a familiar room. From that height, she could see the table from a different angle, the reflections in the glasses, the seams in the table runner, the slight tremor in Richard's hand as he adjusted his watch. Detail had always been her craft. Now it was her advantage. "I'm going to finish the coffee service," she said, rising again. "Not because I must, but because I choose to finish well." Choice again. The word moved like a current under the floorboards. Emily stood when Mary stood, a shadow of solidarity beside her, and together they moved toward the cart. The pianist, as if receiving a cue no one else heard, let a gentler melody thread the air. 3 notes that returned and settled, a loop that sounded like steadiness. In that music, the room found something to hold on to that wasn't pride. Elaine broke her own rule and spoke across the table in front of guests. "Richard, let it pass," she said, not pleading, simply advising. "Sometimes the strongest move is to stop pushing." She didn't say the word humility, but the outline of it was there. He rubbed at his temple, a gesture he rarely allowed in public. Inside, the calculus complicated. He could push and win the minute but lose the narrative. He could retreat and look weakened in the currency he valued. For the first time that evening, his decisions weren't drafting outward obedience. They were drafting consequences he couldn't price. The realization nicked him with a series of small revelations that didn't yet change. But they entered the room and took seats like uninvited auditors. Mary poured coffee with a hand that had steadied thousands of cups in houses where she would never be invited to sit. Tonight, the simple arc of liquid into porcelain held new meaning. She paused at Emily's place. "Sugar?" Mary asked, and the politeness between them felt dignified, not hierarchical. "Please," Emily said, and when Mary added a single spoonful, Emily smiled. Perfect. The exchange didn't correct the night, but it corrected a small piece of it. You rebuild trust in increments. The junior partner spoke again, voice firmer now. "Mary, thank you," he said, like a man practicing a muscle. He glanced at Richard, then chose not to look away this time. "Thank you." Mary nodded once and moved on. She didn't hoard the gratitude. She let it land and pass through. Dignity travels like that, quietly, refusing to be heavy. Richard steadied his breathing, an athlete between sets who can't admit the second half is going to require a different plan. "We will not turn our home into a forum," he said, but his tone had lost a few inches of height. "We'll finish dinner. We'll be gracious." The word gracious caught on something invisible, and Emily watched him feel the catch. He wanted to own it. Tonight it wouldn't let itself be owned. From the doorway, the head of staff, Mr. Collins, shifted his weight, and then, with the unassuming authority of a man who organizes chaos for a living, stepped forward half a pace. "Coffee on the left, tea on the right," he announced to the guests, rescuing the night with logistics. Then he turned to Mary and Emily with a nod so small it might have been a blink. It said, "We're with you." Support sometimes looks like making sure the cups don't run out. As service continued, the temperature of the evening changed. Conversations restarted in a new key, lower and honest. No one wanted to discuss acquisitions anymore. They wanted safer ground, kids' soccer tournaments, traffic on I-93, a museum exhibit in Cambridge. But underneath the small talk, the narrative had been rewritten. Guests who would later tell the story over breakfast would use phrases like "turning point" and "I never saw that side of him." The impact of Emily's choice would ripple in rooms far from this table, changing how people answered calls, returned emails, weighed alliances. That is how a single decision in a private home begins its wider journey. Richard lifted his cup and, for once, tasted the coffee without calculation. It was too hot. He set it down. He looked at Mary, really looked, and then away, the glance too quick to be recognition, but not so quick that it didn't register as a crack. The redemption seed doesn't sprout on command. It waits in the dirt of a person's pride for water they can't admit they need. The room had provided the first rain. Emily remained near Mary, not hovering, not guarding, simply present. "I'm right here," she said once under her breath. Not in for effect, not for the guests, but as a small binding stitch in a fabric that had just been torn. "Thank you," Mary replied, equally quiet. "I won't forget it." "You don't have to," Emily answered. "Just let it count." The pianist's melody smoothed into a progression that sounded like a conclusion but wasn't, a cadence that stopped just before the final note. He lifted his hands and let the remainder ring out in the space, an intentional incompletion that promised movement. Emily caught the shape of that unfinished chord and felt its truth. Nights like this don't end with verdicts. They continue with new terms. People recalibrate in silence. They rethink in their cars with the radio off. They call someone they trust and say, "You won't believe what I saw." That behind-the-scenes processing is where transformation takes root. At the far end of the table, Aunt Elaine leaned to a guest and, in a voice meant to carry only the length of a linen napkin, said, "Kindness ages well." The guest nodded, as if she'd been given a tip that would outperform the market. Mary finished the service, placed the pot back on its warmer, and stood with her hands lightly clasped. She didn't shrink into the wall this time. She stood where she could be seen and not assessed. The difference was small to the eye, enormous to the spirit. She had work left to do in the pantry and lists to check in the morning, but something critical had already shifted. The room had learned where her value lives, and it wasn't in the reflection on a polished spoon. Richard cleared his throat, searched for a line that would make him the architect again, and found none that didn't ring false. He looked at Emily, and whatever he meant to say changed shape before it reached his mouth. She was still beside Mary, calm, grounded, the choice complete, and that picture wouldn't blink out when the lights dimmed. It would follow him, a mirror he hadn't ordered, one he couldn't easily take down. The dessert plates were mostly untouched now, a circle of lemon cooling under sugar crystals that no longer mattered. The guests were finishing their coffee, gathering their coats in their minds, rehearsing polite exits, and in the hum that returns when tension lets go of a room just enough to let it breathe, the new terms held. No applause, no proclamations, just the settled knowledge that something had moved in a way that couldn't be moved back. Emily released Mary's hand at last, not as a withdrawal, but as a handoff to the quiet momentum they had started together. She circled behind the chair and steadied it with a fingertip, an instinctive courtesy. Mary nodded once more, the nod of a person who has reclaimed her center. In that reclaimed center, the next moments were already lining up, not with the stiffness of protocol, but with the calm of decisions that will be carried forward. And as the pianist let the final unresolved chord fade into the room's soft voices, the evening turned a page without closing the book, setting the stage for what would be said and done when the front door opened to the night air and the true measure of this house began to show. Richard Anderson had never felt small in his own home. For decades, the walls of that mansion had echoed with his voice, his laughter, his commands. He was the architect of its grandeur, the curator of its treasures, the man whose very presence could tilt the balance of a room. Yet now, seated at the head of his table, surrounded by crystal, silver, and guests who once hung on his every word, he felt a sensation he could not name at first. It pressed against his chest, tightened his jaw, and made his palms sweat against the polished wood. He tried to ignore it, tried to bury it beneath the familiar posture of arrogance, but it lingered. For the first time in years, Richard was tasting shame. His daughter's hand still rested on the back of Mary's chair, and that simple image kept circling his thoughts like an echo that refused to fade. Emily hadn't shouted, hadn't lost her composure. She had simply spoken with a clarity that made his words sound hollow by comparison. Every time he replayed her voice in his head, the contrast was brutal, her calm truth against his forced bravado. He lifted his wineglass to mask the tremor in his hand, but even the act of drinking betrayed him. The liquid burned down his throat, heavier than it should have been, as if carrying the weight of everything unsaid. Richard had built his life on decisions, on the belief that control was the currency of survival. He told himself that every choice he made was calculated, purposeful, necessary. But tonight, those decisions felt exposed for what they were. Shortcuts that bought him obedience at the cost of respect. The hidden truth, one he had buried for years beneath wealth and power, had broken free. His authority was not infinite. His daughter's courage had revealed its limits. He glanced at the guests, desperate for an anchor, but found none. Charles Whitmore's face was still, unreadable, but his silence spoke of distance. The junior partner, who had dared to thank Mary, avoided his gaze altogether. Even his sister, who had smoothed over countless nights like this before, sat with her glass untouched, her eyes tracing the tablecloth instead of him. The impact was unmistakable. No one here was prepared to prop him up anymore. Inside, pride roared, urging him to strike back. Pride told him to reassert control, to remind everyone who had built this empire, who paid the bills, who owned every brick of this mansion. Pride told him he was losing, and that losing was unforgivable. But shame whispered differently. Shame pointed at Emily, at the unflinching steadiness in her eyes, and reminded him that the one currency he could not buy was respect. If his daughter saw him as cruel, if she believed he was nothing more than a man who used others to inflate himself, then what did all the money mean? What was the mansion worth if it couldn't shield him from that gaze? He tried to speak, but the words clung to his throat like dust. "Emily," he managed, though it came out softer than intended, stripped of command. She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable, her silence louder than any argument. For a fleeting moment, he saw the little girl she once was, running through these halls with scraped knees and laughter that filled every corner. He had once been her hero. When had that shifted? When had the performance replaced the man? The reflection gnawed at him. Behind the facade of success, behind the titles and the cars and the deals, there was a man who feared irrelevance more than anything. That fear had shaped his choices, had made him cling to control like a lifeline. But tonight, as he looked around the table, he realized the cost. He wasn't respected. He was endured. The applause he thought was admiration was closer to compliance, and compliance, he was learning, collapses in the face of truth. Mary's calm presence only deepened the wound. She hadn't fought back, hadn't tried to humiliate him in return. She had simply stood her ground with quiet dignity, and that dignity outshone all his displays of power. It was unbearable to admit, but undeniable. The woman he dismissed as invisible had more moral weight than the millionaire at the head of the table. He rubbed his forehead, as though he could erase the thoughts with pressure. But the revelations kept coming, each one sharper than the last. He thought of his late father, a man who had worked in a steel mill and who once told him, "Respect is earned at the dinner table, not bought with the check." Richard had dismissed the line as sentimental nonsense. Tonight, it replayed in his mind with painful clarity. His father had been right, and he had become the very man his father warned him not to be. "Control is everything," he muttered to himself, too quiet for most to hear. But Emily heard. Her reply was silent, just a shake of her head, slow, deliberate, as if to say, "Not anymore." For the first time in decades, Richard felt the crack of self-doubt split him open. Wealth couldn't protect him here. Influence couldn't restore the silence he had always mistaken for agreement. He was staring at the one truth he had tried to outrun. Power without compassion is hollow. And hollow things, no matter how polished, eventually collapse under their own weight. His pride fought back, desperate for survival. He forced a smile, the kind he had used in 1,000 negotiations, but it slipped almost instantly. His lips trembled, his eyes darted, and everyone saw it. Authority doesn't crumble with shouts. It dissolves with the small betrayals of the body. A clenched jaw, a faltering smile, a hand gripping the table too tightly. Richard was unraveling, and the unraveling was visible. He wanted to stand, to dismiss the gathering, to reclaim the night with the authority of ownership, but his legs felt heavy, as though they understood what his pride refused to accept, that leaving now would be an admission of defeat. So he stayed seated, trapped in the very throne he had carved for himself, the head of a table that no longer bowed to him. Emily's hand still rested near Mary, grounding the room in a dignity he could not command. He realized with a cold clarity that this image would outlive the evening. People would remember it, retell it, carry it into other rooms. It would become a story he could not edit. His downfall wasn't in losing money or status, it was in losing the narrative, in becoming the man whose wealth exposed his poverty of character. He pressed his palm flat against the table, the wood cool beneath his skin. For a second, his mind raced through possibilities, jokes to lighten the mood, excuses to reframe his actions, diversions to steer the evening away from this humiliating exposure. But every option tasted false. And worse, he knew the guests would hear the falseness too. The time for performance had passed. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a reminder that he was no longer in control. Richard had always thought transformation was something he could dictate, something he could engineer for profit. But tonight, he was learning that real transformation isn't planned. It arrives uninvited, through the voices we least expect, stripping away illusions and forcing us to see the hidden truth we've buried. His daughter had become that voice, and he could not silence her without silencing himself. He looked at her again, her face calm, her shoulders squared, her loyalty placed not in him, but in the values he had ignored. The realization hurt more than any business loss ever had. What if she's right? The thought flickered through his mind. What if everything I've built means nothing without respect? The question lodged itself deep, refusing to leave. And in that moment, Richard Anderson, the man who had built an empire on the illusion of control, finally faced the one opponent he could not outmaneuver, himself. The guests shifted uneasily, sipping coffee that had long gone cold, waiting to see what would happen next. The atmosphere wasn't tense anymore, it was expectant, as though the entire room understood that the next words, the next decision, would reveal whether Richard chose to double down on pride or to acknowledge the truth pressing against him. The outcome was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The man who once believed his wealth could shield him from judgment was now standing, unprotected, in the full light of it. The weight of the evening settled into the room like dust after a storm. Richard sat still at the head of his table, his hand gripping the stem of his glass, though he no longer had the appetite to drink. His guests had shifted into uneasy conversation, some attempting to stitch the moment back together with light remarks about the weather or the latest exhibit at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. But the words rang hollow, like music played out of tune. Everyone knew the truth. The dinner had transformed into something no one would forget. Emily remained at Mary's side, not as a child rebelling, but as a young woman standing in a truth bigger than the walls of the mansion. Her presence was a quiet sermon, and it carried more impact than any toast her father had given. She had not only challenged arrogance, she had rewritten the narrative. The room was no longer about power or wealth. It was about dignity, and how fragile or strong it becomes depending on how we choose to treat each other. Richard's pride was still alive inside him, fighting to remind him of his status, whispering that he could repair this later with money, with charm, with excuses. But shame had already carved its mark. He could feel it in the way no one laughed at his attempts to smooth over the scene, in the way the guests' eyes drifted not to him, but to Emily and Mary. For the first time in years, he was not the center of gravity in his own home. He looked at his daughter and saw a reflection of something he had long abandoned, courage that was rooted not in dominance, but in compassion. He thought of the life he had built, of the mindset that drove him to equate worth with control. Deals, contracts, acquisitions, his entire journey had been measured in numbers and titles. Yet tonight revealed the hidden truth he had worked so hard to bury. Authority without respect is hollow, and power without humanity is fragile. His daughter's words, her choice to sit beside the maid, had pierced through the armor he had spent decades building. Emily didn't gloat, didn't press her advantage. She simply stayed, hand still close to Mary's, a gesture that spoke volumes. The lesson wasn't delivered in lectures, but in example. It reminded everyone present, including her father, that transformation doesn't always come from boardrooms or speeches. It comes from small, decisive acts that ripple outward, reshaping how others see the world. Mary, too, stood taller now, though she hadn't moved an inch. The humiliation intended to diminish her had become the very stage on which her dignity was confirmed. She didn't need applause. She didn't need recognition. Her strength came from within, from years of carrying burdens that no one else saw, from decisions made in quiet kitchens and long nights where survival was victory enough. The impact of Emily's defense wasn't just in the words. It was in reminding Mary and everyone watching that no amount of wealth could erase the value of a human being who refuses to surrender their worth. Richard's eyes lingered on Mary, and for the first time he truly saw her, not as part of the machinery that kept his house polished, but as a person. He saw the way her calm steadiness outshone his restless pride, the way her quiet composure made his bluster look small. It was a revelation he hadn't asked for, but one he could not ignore. He shifted in his chair, not to speak, but because the truth had become too heavy to sit with comfortably. The guests were leaving with more than they expected. They had come for fine food, good wine, and a glimpse into the life of a powerful man. What they received was a lesson that would follow them long after dessert was forgotten. Some would tell the story later as gossip, others as a warning, but a few would carry it as a seed of reflection, a reminder of how fragile authority becomes when it loses its moral compass. The piano's melody, soft and unfinished, floated through the air once more, this time like a benediction over the scene. Emily leaned toward Mary and said quietly, "You never deserved what happened tonight. I just wanted you to know that." Mary gave a small nod, her eyes glistening but steady. "I know now," she replied. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of restoration. That was the hidden power of compassion. It didn't erase the past, but it reshaped how the future would be carried. Richard looked at his daughter, and though pride still pulled at him, shame forced him to admit something he had never spoken aloud. "Emily," he said quietly, almost to himself, maybe I've been wrong." The admission was unfinished, but its fracture was enough to let a new possibility seep in. His face, usually composed like marble, revealed something raw: confusion, vulnerability, the first stirrings of humility. The night had revealed a truth larger than one man's: pride. It showed that wealth, when used as a weapon to belittle, leaves the wielder poorer than the one they try to demean. It showed that real leadership isn't about dominance, but about decisions rooted in respect. And it showed that sometimes the greatest transformation begins when the people closest to us refuse to let arrogance go unchallenged. Emily didn't rise to claim victory. She didn't need to. Her father's silence was enough to prove that her stand had shifted something inside him. Even if he couldn't yet admit it fully, the lesson had been planted, and though pride resisted, the seed of humility had found its soil. The chandeliers still glittered, the silverware still shone, but none of it carried the same meaning anymore. What mattered now was not the grandeur of the setting, but the revelation it had contained. Dignity cannot be bought, only given and preserved. The mansion itself, for all its polished beauty, felt smaller compared to the strength of one young woman, standing up for what was right. As the evening drew closer to its quiet unraveling, the image remained: A daughter seated beside the maid her father tried to humiliate, her hand resting gently in solidarity. That was the picture everyone carried with them, the one that spoke more loudly than the finest speech. And in that picture lived the lesson that would outlast the night. True dignity isn't measured by wealth, but by the way we choose to treat those we think are beneath us. Richard Anderson's journey was far from over. The downfall he experienced at that dinner table was only the beginning of something deeper, a confrontation not with his guests or his family, but with himself. For now the room held its breath in the fragile balance between pride and redemption, as if waiting to see which voice inside him he would choose to follow when the night finally let him go. And if you've walked with me all the way to this point, it probably means this story spoke to something in you too. Maybe it reminded you of a moment when dignity mattered more than appearances, or when someone's courage shifted everything in the room. If that's the case, let me know in the comments. Leave a simple phrase like, "I'm with you until the end," or "This message was for me." I'd love to see who carried this reflection all the way through. And while you're here, a quick tap on the like button is always a good way to keep stories like this alive. It tells me this kind of content has a place in your journey too. If you want to keep walking alongside these narratives of transformation and hidden truths, subscribing is the easiest way to stay close. Now, before you go, there's a video right here that continues in the same spirit, exploring another powerful twist that says just as much about who we are. Click and come with me there. We'll pick up the thread together.